Julia Tran had never expected applause, but she also never imagined she would be this invisible. For 8 long years, she'd shown up to every family gathering with a gift in hand, a warm smile on her face, and dishes she'd spent hours preparing. Yet somehow, in every conversation, every photo, and every toast, she simply didn't exist. She was the kind of woman who didn't speak loudly, not because she lacked confidence, but because she had been raised to believe that strength didn't need to announce itself. In her professional world, that quiet strength built railways, literal ones. She managed infrastructure projects that connected cities, moved millions, made lives easier. But in the small, curated world of her husband's family, none of that mattered.
To them, she was just Leo's wife.
That was all they ever called her. Leo's wife. Not Julia. Not Ms. Tran. Just the accessory that showed up on Leo's arm every year to the family's beloved lake resort. Regina, her mother-in-law, had perfected the art of passive condescension. Her voice was always soft, but there was iron in it. When Julia spoke about her latest project, a clean energy rail corridor through the Midwest, Regina would blink twice, nod politely, and turn to her daughter to ask how the nail salon was doing. Julia's words, her work, her passion floated in the air for a moment before dissolving into nothing. She tried. God knows she tried. The first few years, Julia organized the family's travel logistics, printed itineraries, even designed a custom photo album one Christmas. No one mentioned it. One year, she hosted the entire family for Thanksgiving, decorated the house, cooked every meal from scratch. Regina later praised the warm hospitality of Leo's aunt who had brought a single pie. Even Leo, sweet as he was, had mastered the art of vanishing in those moments. He wasn't cruel. He loved her, in his quiet way. But love without courage is just convenience. When Regina offered backhanded compliments or suggested that some women aren't meant for motherhood, he would just smile and gently change the subject. Julia never wanted a knight, but she had hoped for a partner. In those moments, she realized she didn't even have a witness. The lake resort was where it always felt the worst. There, her invisibility became ritualized. She was expected to help unpack everyone's luggage, tidy up the common areas, and make coffee in the mornings, not because anyone asked, but because when she didn't, it just didn't get done. And when it was done, nobody noticed. Her hands moved like clockwork, her smile like wallpaper, present but unseen. One summer afternoon, she stood at the edge of the lake while the rest of the family posed for a photo on the dock. Leo waved her over. "Babe, come take a picture," he said. "Not be in the picture."
"Take it."
So she did. She took the photo, adjusted the angle, made sure the sunlight was flattering. And when she stepped back, watching them laugh, she realized something broke. Not loudly. Not like glass, but like paper worn thin from too many folds, soft, silent, and irreversible. That night, while they laughed over wine and board games, Julia sat alone by the fire pit. She wasn't sad, just tired. Tired of shrinking herself to fit into rooms that would never acknowledge her presence. Tired of trying to earn love that was always withheld just far enough to keep her in place. Tired of being Leo's wife when she was so much more. She didn't know it yet, but something in her was already shifting. Not rage. Not vengeance. Something quieter, stronger. The kind of knowing that doesn't need to shout. She didn't want to be seen by them anymore. She wanted to see herself. And this time, that would be enough. There were no bruises. No scars you could circle on a diagram. No broken bones to hold up as evidence. But Julia carried her wounds like stones sewn into the lining of her coat, heavy, quiet, and always close to the skin. She had learned early that not all pain makes a sound, and not all suffering leaves a mark the world is willing to recognize. In the quiet moments between conference calls and cleaning up after Leo's relatives, her mind would replay the tiny incisions, those paper-cut cruelties that came dressed in civility. "You don't have kids yet? Oh, I guess you've been too busy with your job. You're always so serious, Julia. You should smile more. You probably don't understand. It's a cultural thing. It was never shouted. It didn't have to be. The hurt came laced in honey, served on polite platters, and passed around like hors d'oeuvres. And like any well-trained woman of color in white suburban gatherings, Julia learned to nod, to smile, to swallow it down and let it settle in the pit of her stomach like lead. At night, she sometimes cried without knowing why. The tears came not as storms, but as a slow leak from a pipe long neglected. She'd sit in the shower, hot water masking the salt, wondering what part of herself she had abandoned to fit into a space that never truly welcomed her. And Leo, he wasn't cruel, but cruelty doesn't always come with intent. Sometimes it arrives in the form of absence, of silence, of a man who listens with kind eyes but does nothing when the arrows are drawn. When his sister joked about Julia being too independent to be maternal, he chuckled awkwardly, sipped his wine, and let the moment die in the air. When his mother critiqued Julia's cooking for not being traditional, he changed the subject to football. It wasn't that he agreed with them. It was just easier not to fight. But every time he let it go, a piece of her felt more alone. She started waking up early, before the rest of the house, not because she wanted solitude, but because she needed space to breathe without performing. She would walk down to the lake with a cup of coffee and watch the fog lift. The stillness became her sanctuary. The trees didn't ask questions. The water didn't whisper judgment. It just existed, honest and unashamed. In her journal, tucked between architectural sketches and engineering notes, she began to write again. Not about bridges or transportation corridors, but about grief, the grief of being unseen, the grief of giving and always feeling like a guest in her own life. She didn't write to be read. She wrote to remember that her thoughts were real, that her voice had texture, depth, gravity. Sometimes she fantasized about disappearing, not out of despair, but as an act of quiet rebellion. Just walking away one day, without noise or drama, and letting the void teach them the value of her presence. Maybe then, in her absence, they would notice the warmth that left with her. The meals no longer made. The questions no longer asked. The peace she brought just by absorbing the chaos they created. But she never left. Not yet. Endurance, after all, was her fluency. Like many women taught to survive before they were taught to dream, Julia wore resilience like second skin. She didn't explode. She endured. She became an expert at holding things in place, even when everything inside her begged for release. It was a long ache, not a sharp one. But prolonged ache teaches something that comfort never will. It sharpens your gaze. It shows you who will bleed for you, and who will simply watch you bleed. And in those wordless hours by the lake, she began to see with terrifying clarity that her survival had never been accidental. It was skill. It was will. It was the armor she'd forged from years of being overlooked, underestimated, and still rising. No one had noticed her endurance. But that didn't mean it wasn't heroic. It wasn't the loudest insult, nor the most vicious. But sometimes cruelty doesn't shout. It whispers just loud enough to crack something sacred. And for Julia, that moment came on an unremarkable Sunday, in the bright kitchen where sunlight streamed through spotless windows and the smell of roast chicken mingled with the quiet tension of family. She had been arranging a tray of glasses, listening to Leo's mother and sister talk about holiday plans, nodding politely even though no one had directly spoken to her in over 10 minutes. Leo was fixing something in the garage, unreachable as always when the subtle barbs began. Julia, who had cooked the meal, cleaned the house, and welcomed everyone in with grace, now stood invisible at the center of her own generosity. Then it happened. So casual, so sharp. Leo could have married someone simpler. Someone who actually wanted to be part of this family. The words dropped like broken china on a marble floor, silent for a beat, and then echoing everywhere. She didn't turn around, didn't ask for clarification, didn't gasp or cry or drop the tray in some cinematic display of heartbreak.
No.
Julia simply set the glasses down one by one, her fingers trembling just slightly at the edges. Her heart thudded in her chest like it was trying to warn her of something too big to ignore this time. That sentence, the brutal efficiency of it, cut through years of practiced silence. It was not the first insult, but it was the one that told the truth behind all the others. It was never about fitting in. It was about never being enough for people who had already decided they didn't want to see her. She walked upstairs quietly. The house was still full of murmurs and clinking forks, the air heavy with roast and wine. She closed the bedroom door softly, sat on the edge of the bed they had bought together, but which always felt like his. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself not just to feel, but to burn. She didn't cry. Not this time. Something had hardened. Something had shifted. Because in that sentence, something else had become visible too, not just their cruelty, but the deep truth of her own betrayal. Leo never stopped them. He never interrupted their unkindness. He had been a silent co-signer to every wound. That realization stung more than the sentence itself. All those years she had worked to belong, to prove she was kind, generous, capable of love and worthy of it in return. And yet, here she was, still seen as an outsider, still spoken about as a mistake made permanent. It wasn't rage she felt, it was awakening. The kind of awakening that cracks like thunder beneath the skin, that shakes the furniture of your soul. She looked around the room, not at the pictures of trips where she smiled for the sake of peace, not at the wedding photo framed neatly on the nightstand, but at her own reflection in the mirror across the bed. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't flinch. She saw a woman standing on the edge of something profound. This wasn't just about a mother-in-law. It wasn't just about Sunday dinners or side comments. It was about how easy it had been for them to erase her while still consuming everything she gave. Julia stood up.
Slowly. Carefully.
Not with panic or fury, but with purpose. She walked back downstairs, but this time she didn't fold herself smaller. She didn't slip back into the role of the accommodating hostess. She stood in the doorway of that immaculate kitchen and, without raising her voice, looked directly at the woman who had spoken. "I heard what you said," she said calmly. "And you're right. Leo could have married someone simpler. But he didn't. And you don't get to rewrite that." Then she turned to Leo, who had finally come in, his hands still stained with grease, confused by the sudden stillness. She looked at him not with accusation, but with clarity. "I won't let myself disappear in this house anymore." It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. And though the room fell silent, Julia felt a storm rising inside her, steady, wild, liberating. A woman who had bent herself to keep the peace had finally found the one sentence that undid years of silent shrinking. A cruel sentence had been spoken, but it had not broken her. It had set her free. In the days that followed, Julia did not scream, argue, or explain herself. She simply became still, like the eye of a storm that had passed through everything she once thought was permanent. The words spoken that Sunday had torn away the last veil she had clung to, the illusion that loyalty, kindness, and effort could change people determined not to see her worth. And so, with that clarity, she began again, not with rage, but with resolve. Every morning, she rose before the sun. While Leo remained buried in his sleep and his indifference, Julia sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a notebook filled with quiet plans. She had always loved places with soft lights, warm service, and the comforting hum of life lived slowly, resorts by the ocean or tucked into the woods, where people came to feel seen again. And she remembered something she had once said, long before marriage dulled her edges. "If I ever had the chance, I'd build a place where people could breathe again." Now, that voice inside her, the one she'd muted for too long, was speaking louder than ever. So she followed it. There was an old resort outside the city, nestled between pines and forgotten roads. It had once been elegant, decades ago, but had since fallen into quiet disrepair. Julia had visited it once with Leo, who had scoffed at its faded charm. But she had seen its soul, the weathered balconies, the scent of cedar in the air, the worn marble floors that still held echoes of laughter and barefoot dances. Now, she saw opportunity where others saw dust. Using a modest inheritance from her late aunt, a woman who had also been overlooked all her life, Julia approached the silent owner of the property. A man in his 70s, half blind and half tired, who looked at Julia as if trying to remember something he'd forgotten in himself. And perhaps that's why he agreed to sell, not to the highest bidder, but to the woman who spoke of breath, light, dignity, and sanctuary. She didn't tell Leo. Not because she was being secretive, but because it was no longer about him. This was hers. Entirely. And for the first time, that felt not only possible but right. She spent her days learning everything: building permits, plumbing, linens, lighting, food sourcing, guest psychology. She hired people who were often overlooked themselves: a single mother with scars of her own, a veteran with a limp and a soft voice, a teenager who had dropped out but designed websites like poetry. Together, they swept out the dust and planted wildflowers by the gate. The walls were painted warm, the fireplaces repaired, and music returned to the halls like a heartbeat rediscovered. She named it Alira, a name that meant nothing to anyone but her. It was a word she'd once scribbled in a forgotten journal, back when dreams had wings and no one had clipped them yet. She didn't promote it loudly. No billboard. No desperate marketing. Just word of mouth, honest reviews, and the rare kind of warmth people carried home and whispered to others. Slowly, guests returned. First a couple escaping grief, then an artist who had lost his muse, then an elderly woman who hadn't smiled in a year. They came, they rested, and they left different. And every morning, Julia greeted them, not as a boss in heels and suits, but in jeans and soft sweaters, with tea in hand and kindness in her eyes. She didn't need them to know her story. She simply wanted them to feel whole. Back home, Leo barely noticed the shift. He thought she was keeping busy with some hobby project, something to fill the hours between dinners and obligations.
He didn't ask.
And she didn't correct him. She had stopped needing validation from the ones who never saw her. It was not secrecy, it was peace. And then, one day, one of Leo's colleagues brought his wife to Alira. The man returned raving about the place, its grace, the way every detail felt personal, the way even silence felt like a gift. And when he told Leo, he laughed. You wouldn't believe it. It's owned by some woman named Julia. That was the day Leo realized something had changed, irreversibly. But Julia didn't gloat. She didn't flash the deed in anyone's face. She simply stood at the edge of her own land, watching guests arrive with tired eyes and leave lighter. She had become something more than a wife, more than a placeholder in someone else's legacy. She had built her own world, brick by brick, grace by grace, in silence. And for the first time in years, she no longer needed to be seen because she finally saw herself. The evening began like any other, quiet, rehearsed, forgettable. Julia had agreed, out of habit more than desire, to attend a business dinner Leo had been organizing for weeks. He wanted to impress a potential investor from out of town, a man whose money could supposedly elevate Leo's name into another circle of power. Julia said yes without emotion, as if reading lines in a play she no longer believed in. She wore a dress she hadn't touched in years. It was soft blue, with a neckline that framed her grace instead of demanding attention. Her hair was pinned loosely, her jewelry minimal, and yet there was something different in her presence, an ease, an unshakable calm that made her seem both familiar and unfamiliar at once. Leo didn't notice. His eyes were already fixed on himself in the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, asking about his cologne. The restaurant was lavish, the kind of place with chandeliers like frozen waterfalls and waiters who moved like shadows. Leo greeted everyone with charm. Julia sat beside him, smiling politely, speaking when spoken to, observing more than engaging. She had done this 100 times, played the gracious wife while men talked in loud, performative tones about markets, takeovers, and metrics. But this night had its own current, subtle and sharp. The investor arrived. Middle-aged, well-groomed, a man who seemed to weigh people with his eyes. Leo launched into his pitch, sleek and rehearsed, all numbers and confidence. Julia sipped her wine in silence, until the man's gaze landed on her with a flicker of familiarity. "I feel like I know you," he said, tilting his head. Julia offered a soft smile. "Perhaps we've crossed paths somewhere."
He paused.
"Actually, wait. I think we've met at a resort not long ago. Beautiful place. Hidden in the woods. My wife and I stayed there for our anniversary. What was it called? His eyes lit up. Elira. That's it.
God, it was extraordinary.
The woman who owns it, what a presence. She made my wife cry in a good way. Said something about how healing isn't loud, it's patient. Do you know it? The table fell silent. Leo choked slightly on his drink. You've been to Elira? The man nodded, turning back to Julia.
Yes.
That's where I remember you. You were there, weren't you? Julia held his gaze gently. Yes, I was. Leo narrowed his eyes. You mean you visited?
She didn't look at him. No.
I own it. The words landed without apology. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, undeniable. The investor blinked, caught off guard. Wait, you're the owner? Julia nodded. Yes. And then the silence broke like glass. Leo laughed, at first nervously, then incredulously. That's impossible. You never mentioned anything. That place is, people talk about it like it's sacred. You've been managing a resort behind my back. Julia turned to him for the first time that night, her voice still soft but carved from stone. Not behind your back. Just without your permission. Because I never needed it. The investor leaned back in his chair, visibly intrigued now. She's not exaggerating. That resort? It's something else. Authentic.
Precise.
Every corner reflects care. I thought it was owned by a seasoned hospitality veteran. I've been in training for years, Julia said calmly. Just not where anyone was looking. Leo flushed with confusion, anger, and something else, fear. For the first time, he was not the one holding the secret. The rest of the dinner unfolded like a quiet unraveling. Leo fumbled to recover, to redirect the conversation, but the air had shifted. Julia no longer sat as the silent ornament to his ambition. She was the room's gravity now, even in silence. When dessert arrived, the investor leaned toward Julia with a curious smile. If you're ever looking to expand, I'd be honored to talk. Places like Elira, real places, are rare. And people like you don't come around often. Julia thanked him with warmth, but gave no answer. She had no desire to rush into more. Not out of pride, but out of peace. She had spent too many years trying to be seen in a house where no one looked. Now, the world was seeing her for who she truly was.
And it was enough.
As they left the restaurant, Leo walked a few steps behind her. Not out of courtesy, but because he didn't know what to say. His wife, the woman he dismissed as fragile and unambitious, had built something he could never buy, never own, never understand. And he knew, deep down, that a door had closed. Julia stepped into the night, the air cool against her skin. For once, she wasn't waiting to be noticed. The truth had found its way out, not with noise, but with undeniable grace. And the world had listened. The morning after the dinner, Julia woke up before the sun. The silence in the house was different now, not the heavy, resentful kind that used to sit like fog in the corners of each room, but a clean, expectant stillness. As if the very walls had heard what happened the night before and were holding their breath, waiting for what came next. She stood by the window, coffee in hand, wrapped in the same soft robe she had worn for years. But today, even the way the fabric touched her skin felt different. Lighter. Truer. She was no longer a ghost in her own life. The woman staring back at her in the glass was not invisible, not small, not waiting for permission to be whole. Leo had barely spoken since the dinner. He had come home with a pale face, pacing like a man realizing he had slept through an earthquake. He didn't yell, didn't accuse. He simply didn't know how to exist in a world where Julia was not beneath him, but beyond him. His silence wasn't peace, it was disorientation. He had lost the script, and the woman who once lived by it had rewritten the entire play. By noon, Julia packed a small bag. Not with bitterness, not in haste, but with intention. She folded her clothes with care, each item a quiet declaration of autonomy. When she reached the door, Leo was there, still in yesterday's shirt, eyes rimmed red, mouth slightly open as if rehearsing words he could no longer say. She looked at him without hate, just clarity. "I'm not leaving to punish you," she said, voice steady as wind through trees. "I'm leaving because I've finally arrived, somewhere you never thought I could exist." He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The taxi ride was quiet. The city moved around her like a slow-motion film. Julia didn't need dramatic music or declarations. Her freedom didn't come in fire. It came in calm. A calm that had cost her years of invisibility, of swallowing pain, of bending into spaces too small for her soul. Now she walked with her spine uncurved, her name no longer a whisper hidden behind a man's shadow. When she arrived at Alira, the staff greeted her with warmth and reverence. They didn't just see her as a boss, but as a builder, as the woman who had created a sanctuary from the fragments of her own sorrow. She walked the grounds barefoot that evening, feeling the earth press back with each step. Every stone, every blossom, every breeze whispered, "You are here. You made this. And it is good." The guests at the resort knew her now, not as some distant figurehead, but as the soul of the place. She spoke to them not like a businesswoman performing a role, but like someone who understood why they had come. To heal, to remember, to be seen. A woman approached her by the reflecting pool, tears in her eyes, and said, "You don't know me, but being here, I feel like I can breathe again." Julia smiled softly. That's all I ever wanted. Later that night, she stood beneath the canopy of stars. No longer defined by someone else's gaze, no longer living in reaction to someone else's absence. The moonlight spilled down on her face like recognition. She thought about the girl she had been, the one who waited at dinner tables, folded laundry with shaking hands, begged silently to be chosen. That girl had not been weak. She had been surviving. But now, Julia was living. Not loud, not vengeful, but luminous. Her story was no longer about endurance, it was about arrival. And this time, she would not step back into the shadows. She had walked through silence, through cruelty, through the slow erosion of the self, and emerged not bitter, but brilliant. Not hardened, but whole. She was not Leo's wife. Not someone's daughter-in-law. Not the woman who once asked for scraps of attention at dinner tables. She was Julia Rivers. The woman who rose. The woman who healed. The woman who finally stood in the light and stayed.